In the last episode, I went over adding VCR to your Ruby code base. Specifically, we had a VCR cassette that records an API request to this free Studio Ghibli API, which is a GET request to this URL, to this app on Heroku. We manipulate the data a little, sort it, return it. We get these strings in alphabetical order. Let's just go ahead and run that, and it passes. It uses a cassette that we then have to manage in this YAML file that encapsulates the entirety of the HTTP request. VCR can be quite nice in that you just wrap your code that's going to call out to the API, the external API, with a block of code, or you can just even use a meta tag in RSpec. But I found in my career that maintaining those cassettes can be quite difficult, especially when they become stale or if the API changes. There are different settings for VCR to re-record the cassettes of the test data. The cassettes are just like the whole request saved to YAML. It's just like this extended metaphor. But yeah, VCR is great at times, but it can be a lot to work with and manage. And I think lately, at least in my work, I've been doing something that's a little bit simpler, where you maybe have less of a realistic kind of like stubbed out API request, but it's good enough and generally gets the job done. So let's go through taking VCR out of this, and we'll just use Webmock. Now, Webmock was already added to the code base because we're using it with VCR. If we look at our requests helper here, we are hooked into Webmock to detect the HTTP requests and raise the error. So like when we get rid of the cassette, the code base, the test suite raises an exception saying it's unhandled. But let's go ahead and let's get rid of VCR, and we'll just use just Webmock, and I'll show you what that looks like in practice and why I like Webmock's API. Let's delete this. This stays the same. Also for this Ghibli class, we have a unit test that mocks the HTTP GET and returns some data, just a subset of the data, which is all fine. Fine. But we're getting rid of VCR, and then we might just have to do one little bit of config for Webmock. I think we have to require Webmock RSpec. So in our request helper, we'll require Webmock RSpec. And that gives us some RSpec syntaxiness with Webmock. That's quite nice. So now if we go back and we run this test, it fails for a different error. Before that was a VCR error about the request not being handled. Now it's a Webmock error saying net connect not allowed error, because we don't want to allow actual network connections in our test suite, right? Our test suite is running on CI, which maybe it doesn't even allow external requests. Also, you might get rate limited if you're running your test suite all the time, and then you're going to get like failed responses back. Maybe you'll get a 404 or a 5XX response that causes your test suite to fail. It's non-deterministic because your test suite, it shouldn't be relying on these external HTTP requests, generally speaking. So then what we want to do is we want to take the data that you expect to receive, include it in the code base as like a fixture file, which is basically what VCR is doing for us. But with Webmock, we're going to craft it by hand, and we're just going to include what we need, basically. So it even gives us the code that we need to add, which is quite nice. So we're just going to paste it in. So stub request Ghibli API Heroku Films. With these headers, I usually delete these because we don't need them. If we were posting, you can do with body and then have your body, and you can like do to JSON, you know, like foo bar or whatever you're doing. That's cool. But for this, we don't have a body for our request, so we don't need it. But then what we do have is to return, and then we do have a body here, and you have so much ability to specify headers and the status and all these different aspects. But really, we just care about status 200 and the body. And here's where Webmock gets, well, let's run this test actually. So we run it, it fails, we expect that because we are, oh, I didn't change post back to get. It's nice in that Webmock shows you the registered request stubs here, just so you can quickly see what went wrong. Let's make this a little taller. So unexpected token at empty string, because that's not JSON, but we're calling JSON parse. So here, if we just did an empty JSON object, we'll get a different failure, which is that is interesting that it failed, because I would think, oh, sorry, it's still post. What did I do? Did I undo it? Oh, well. Okay, now we see the error. Expect empty string to include all these Studio Ghibli films, which is not what we want. So what I would do in this case is I would take this net HTTP code, I would just run it from my IRB. So in this, like if you're using Rails, you could open up a Rails console, and then I'm just gonna go ahead and run it. We've got this big response, which I think is a lot to manage, but what we can do is we can say json.parse. We may have to require JSON. Oops. So we'll require JSON, and then we'll have to parse that. So we'll do bodies json.parse. If we do underscore, that's the last return thing in IRB. So now we have this array, right? Bodies class is an array. And let's do pretty print body. And that is this massive array, right, with all the data. And I'm going to select it. I'm going to copy it to my clipboard, and then in my spec folder, I'm going to delete cassettes, and instead I'm going to make a directory called fixtures. I'm going to make a file called ghiblifilms.json. I'm going to paste that in. I don't have what I expected. Oh. Let's do this way. This is certainly more cumbersome than using VCR in this regard. Like if you want to have this full data, but with VCR, it's doing so much that you then have to manage it, which is unappealing to me, and especially in like a lot of the work I do. So here we have we made the request in the console, we've got it there in that JSON file. Now what we can do is we'll read that file. So we'll just say film response. And we'll do something like film response is equal to file.read fixtures Ghibli films JSON. That might be file.open. We'll see. But now if we run that, okay, it passes because it says that file doesn't exist. So we'll change the path to get to it a little bit. Let's see why this is failing. Got a lot of red, so it looks like it's loading it up and it's saying unexpected token at this point. So we've got our array. That's surprising to me that it's failing. Oh, I see the problem. It's because this is like Ruby hash rockets, so we'll just do this. We'll find and replace all those. And now this is like actual JSON. Also, I keep saying JSON, but I usually say JSON. There's this running joke with my coworker Anthony where only when we're on calls do we say JSON, but then when in our heads and when we speak out loud, we say JSON. So I'm in my head about it. But yeah, that was all Ruby, and we instead want it to be JSON. So if you wanted to, we could instead like paste this giant request response body into here's another thing. I'll show you. I'll just do it instead of talking through it. But this is one way to go about it, and I really like this approach, especially if you're the response body is quite large, like it is in this case, and I think it's quite nice. Also, you have this fixture file that you could then use elsewhere, like in our Ghibli class. We're mocking it with this data here, but we could instead use our fixture, right? Like we could do something like, we could take this, we could say film response, and we could just say it returns URI with film response, even here. And that's quite nice. That's interesting that that's failing on line 7. Oh, it's because file and a string. What do we just call toString? Oh, I think we have to call .read. Maybe that just automatically works with Webmock in that other case. But here we see our test fails because we have all of the films now from this fixture file. And I don't really think we need that for this unit test because it's such a large response body. And here we're just like unit testing the behavior. So I'm not really too concerned about that. But it is nice in that if you're building your own fixture files, you can just do it there. Now that path that's like what I would do in like a production app where we're making important API requests and you're confident that it's like a stable API. But if you have just like a really simple request, we could instead just do something like this, where we would take a Ruby object and we'll just call toJSON on it, and we'll fabricate it like we do here. Like in that unit test, we could just fabricate the response and have a partial response, and we're still saying, like this stub request is still saying, hey, this API request is being made to this URL, it's a GET request, and okay, return this data, right? This is like our test data, and then expect it to return the data formatted how we want it to be. We fail because it's just a partial data, where here this had, we wanted more of it, but like if we just change that a little, that's gonna pass. I would expect it to pass. Yeah. I don't know why that's not passing. That's interesting. It looks like it's okay, now it's passing. I guess maybe it was just there was some extra new lines and formatting that wasn't desirable. So that's an option 2 with Webmock. And I think, honestly, like, it's up to you to try it and see how you prefer working. But let's say, like, here's where I like it more than VCR. With VCR, you have to set up all the data to make the request that with the credentials and the config and everything to make the request. But with Webmock, I think it's quite a bit easier to make branching paths be covered in your code. So you could say something like, it responds with 400, we'll just say 400, or 5. Oh, let's see, HTTP error codes. I'm trying to think of what's like a generic error. Client error, server errors. This would be a server error. Let's just say it's 500 when the API is down. Whoops. Now here's what we would do is we would say get. We would say expect response body to include and we'll say something like status 2i. I think we have status 2i, 2 equal 500. And now we'll run that. Oops, I didn't finish setting up some things that we need, which is we'll have if Studio Ghibli's API return we'll have it return a 500 too, and that's key to making this work. So we'll run this and we'll see what happens. We get JSON parse error, unexpected token at empty string, because this is empty string. We'll just say something isn't quite right. Let's run that again. We'll see our error, and it should include unexpected token, something isn't quite right. And that is exactly what we wanted. So here, it's trying to JSON parse on the net HTTP response, and that is not what we want to do. So let's look at Ruby net HTTP response and see some more info about that class, because I don't know exactly. I want to see status. Okay, so we have res code, res body, get response. I wonder if we need to do get response. We'll see in a sec. But that is cool. So I think we can have something that says if response dot code is not equal to 100. We'll do some, like, this isn't the best code, right? We'll just have it return false. And maybe what we should do instead actually is we'll unit test that. So we'll say it returns false when the API request is not a 200. And this is where I think this unit testing is really nice with that end-to-end test. So we'll say expected to receive get with the kind of URI, which is great. But we'll instead have it return an instance double of let's see what the class of that is. Require net HTTP. Whoops. Let's see if we have our past example. Yeah, we do. Okay, so that's interesting, and then it just returns a string. So let's use this get response, and we'll get the full response. So now we have res.status, res.code, res.class. Is net HTTP okay? Net HTTP. We've got net HTTP okay. So let's actually refactor that to be quite a bit different. So we'll say instance double. We know the class is net HTTP okay. And then it's going to have res.body and res.status, or res.code. So it's going to have code, which is 200, and it's going to have body, which is this array of JSON data. All right, so that is going to drive out a refactor here. We'll take this, and I don't know, so HTTP, let's see what internal server error. Let's see if there's an internal server error. There sure is. So we'll change our instance double to be HTTP internal server error, change the code to be 500, and we'll have the body be just like an empty string. Or no, we'll make it consistent. We'll say something's not right. Now if we go here, we change this, we'll say expect Ghibli films to be false. Run these tests, see what happens. And what do we get? We get a couple errors. This first one fails because we're calling get here, but we need to do get response. And then here we want to do response.body. Run that again. Here it's our new test we added, returns false, but instead it's returning the array. So that's surprising. Then here we're expecting it to equal these things, but it's to equal this array, but we're instead getting this other array. So that's also surprising because I wouldn't have expected that for either of them. So curious what's happening. Let's run one at a time and we'll go from there. So, oh, I see the problem. We're actually making the network requests, and we don't want to be doing that because now we're stepping get response instead of get, and that is our main difference now. So if we just run that new test we added, we have JSON parser error, something's not right because our code has a bug in it. So now if we change that, we get nil instead of false. Let's just return false. You could imagine raising an exception or returning a more useful error message, but for now, I think that works. We'll run the other test. That passes. So because we changed the method we call on net_HTTP, we had to change the return object, which is this net HTTP, whatever the response is, with a different code. So now we have this unit test that's functioning nicely. Now we kind of zoom back out because we were just zoomed in at the unit level. And then now let's go back to our request spec and run it and see what's going on there. Now we're getting a new error that says undefined method join for false class because Ghibli Films is returning false. So what I think we could do is just refactor it and we'll say if films join, else, what do we say? We'll say, So let's run that test again. It's failing because we expected a 500 but got a 200. Sinatra status code Ruby. Let's see how we do that. I forget what we do. Status 400. Okay, so we just do status 500. Run that again. Great, that test passes. Up here, I want to say that let's cover the status to be 200 up there. And it's getting status 200, so that's surprising to me. That this is failing, because I don't understand why. What if we set that there? Okay, that's interesting. That this isn't working. I wonder if what this is returning. Let's throw Ghibli films. Maybe we have a bug in our Ghibli.films. Okay, that's throwing false. So I think what I would do is here I would throw response.code. Let's see what's happening there. 200. But you see, 200 is a string. So that is a bug that was caught with our unit test code. So now if we make those strings in our unit tests, run it, our tests are going to fail because what we need to do is say code.toI. And that's interesting because like here, it returned a 200. So as a string, and I just missed that. And that's kind of what happens when you're like fabricating your world in your unit tests. You can kind of have mistakes. And then this end-to-end test helps catch it, which I think is really, really important and fantastic. We have these throws that I use to help debug because we don't have a debugger in this code base. Now everything's passing. And that covers how you would use Webmock. You can stub request and do that, and then assert like on the response body and what happens. You can also you can say like expect stub, so you can, I'll show you that actually, because I think it's kind of cool. You can instead say this, stub is equal to that. We'll just call it films stub. You can say expect films stub to have been requested. That's another syntax that just more explicitly says, okay, this request needs to be done, because we can make that fail if we added one like, we'll call it characters. And if we said characters stub to have been requested, that's going to fail because that request was never made. And so if you're writing code at this like request or end-to-end level that is exercising the full stack of your app, and you're like, we have to make this API request with this data, right? You could say like with body food bar to JSON with certain headers, et cetera, et cetera. You can really be explicit and then say expect it to have been requested. So that's nice, but generally I view these requests as side effects, and this, like, if this doesn't get requested, this isn't going to pass, and we're going to have problems. So that's using Webmock. To be honest with you, I prefer Webmock over VCR. I like being able to have control and flexibility over this. It does require more work to use Webmock and upfront, and that you have to make the requests and record them yourself if they're large and complex like this, and put them in a fixture file. But I think working with this JSON file is quite simple and nice to use. So VCR might be easier to record the requests, but I think managing VCR is more work than it is to manage Webmock. And I think either work. It's a great thing to have, especially if you're building something that relies on other external HTTP APIs. And either way, I hope these videos help. There's a lot more to both Webmock and VCR in terms of config options, settings, ways you can pass data in the different options, and they're beyond the scope of this episode, but both have great docs and good readmes that will get you pretty far. So thanks a lot and take care.